all. This is Dr. Mobeen Sayed from drbeen.com. Welcome to one more show. So the study today, or an article or a paper, it is from Hong Kong, and someone sent it to me. It is behind a paid paywall, and the point of the paper is the number one. They have a good thing in there, and that is the stats for the retractions of the COVID papers. And then they have some opinions or their analysis for why this retraction may be. So as we go through this, you'll find out that the accusations that authors have, or pointing out of what may be the problems, ethical problems, integrity problems that people may have had, the research workers, because of which their papers got retracted, you would see a reflection of the same problem in this paper as well. And that was interesting for me. So whoever sent it to me, thank you very much. But this paper in itself needs to be corrected. So let's start. This is the paper, Accountability in Research Policies and Quality Assurance, an Alarming Retraction Rate for Scientific Publications on Coronavirus Diseases, 2019. So if I can very quickly show you the references here. So this is drbeen.com. In the description of this video, there is a link with an amazing discounted price for drbeen.com. So take advantage of that. Here is the paper. I just want to quickly hover over the name. So this is Nicole Shu Ling Yeo Te, a Research Compliance and Integrity Office, National University of Singapore, Singapore, Republic of Singapore. So that's one. And then Bor Luen Tang, a Research Compliance and Integrity Office, National University of Singapore. So research, compliance, and integrity, big deals, important jobs. The paper itself is available for 2 days for $50. I thought I wasted some money on this because I want to show you something. So let's look at what they have. Some things that are interesting. So first of all, what they're saying is that during the So George, thank you very much for your comment. Please do not spam or I'll have to take care of it. Okay, so they said that it is true that during the pandemic, as there was an intention and there was a guidance from WHO to accelerate the control of the pandemic and the management of it. So because of that, there were generally a feeling of urgency to provide as much data to public as possible. And that was nothing bad. It was good. In addition to that, the journals in which the papers were being printed, studies were being printed, these journals had also made majority of these papers free access. So there was a lot of information available freely, which allowed even more information to be put together. People looked at some of those researches and said, all right, I'm going to go research here, I'm going to go research there, I'll do a meta-analysis. So the whole community actually participated. And because of that, during the COVID time, the number of papers printed had a record number. At the same time, if you see here, expedited processing was done by journals, for example, Personality and Individual Differences, PAID, and Elsevier Journal, and manuscripts submitted to Hindvi journals enjoy article processing fee waivers. So these actions were also in line with the way WHO wanted. Then they talk about the number of papers. So look at this. They say that we started looking for COVID-19 in the title of the paper and or abstract of the paper. So they went through the databases that contain the papers and looked for COVID-19 in the title or abstract. And they found on 3 May 2020 May, 7,440 articles. And by June 8, May to June, just 3 May to June, almost a month, little over a month, 17,559. So you could see the proliferation, the amount of papers that were being submitted and printed. A closer scrutiny of the earlier articles indicate that the earliest COVID-19 paper on PubMed appeared in February 2020. So then, this is very interesting. To date, the average rate by which papers on COVID-19 appear in PubMed was therefore about 137 papers per day. That's a lot of papers. 137 papers on the same one thing per day, compared to an average of 6 papers per day on H1N1 in the year following its declaration as a pandemic. So when H1N1 was declared pandemic and the year following that, there were just 6 papers per day. And here we have 137 papers per day. The point they're making is, number one, they're providing very decent data sets. That is good. And then they're making this point that there were a lot of papers. So of course, there was going to be errors as well. Then they say by June 2020, COVID-19 has only been identified to be a serious health condition. So it's not that it was actually said to be really bad. It was still just a serious health condition. And then this is an interesting point that they make for the journals. They say that normally a journal says that on average, we take, because of the rigorous review process, we take 5 to 6 months at least to publish a paper. There are some journals that take a year. But the authors are saying that if that is the case, then how come the papers were appearing within 3-4 months of the pandemic's start? Where was that 5.5 month or 6 months long review process? So again, they're pointing out that there is an issue with the process. These things that they're pointing out are actually fine. What you would see is near the end of this paper, that as they start giving examples, they themselves show their own bias, which they're criticizing others for the biases, and they show their own bias. That would be interesting. Okay, so they're saying that within yet over 17,000 publications were fortunate enough to have such expedited publication process from beginning to June. Then they say that because there were so many publications, there is inadvertent errors and inaccuracies, as well as varying degrees of misinformation. And now I would actually editorialize that a little bit and say there may be deliberate misinformation, and there may be unknowingly adding something in there. That could be possible because we were in the heat of the problem. So then what they did was, they said that we looked at another database. So there is a database called Retraction Watch database. It's actually interesting to go to the Retraction Watch database and search for various keywords to see how many retractions have occurred. So they say that then we went to the Retraction Watch database. We pulled the retraction records using the word COVID-19 in the title. And they said we retrieved 6 items on 3 May 2020 and 17 on 8 June 2020, which means 5 and 13 unique articles on record that were retracted. So not only there were 17,000-ish studies that were there were already 13 unique studies that had been retracted. These have either been fully retracted, withdrawn, tagged with editorial expression of concerns, or issued with a corrigendum, so adding a page of corrections. So now they're giving some examples. For example, in one of the retraction notices available online, the authors specifically deeply apologize for this premature publication. So good. Author said, hey, we should not have done it. We are taking it back. Now, just if you're curious that what kind of examples they actually give. Remember, there was a Indian study that came out that said there was a a fingerprint of HIV genetic material or sequence, which was then retracted. They gave that example. They gave the Lancet's example of, remember Sergi Sphere and the hydroxychloroquine debacle? They gave that example. Or they gave one more example of hydroxychloroquine study. So what they did not talk about were so many other studies that you could consider mainstream studies, more acceptable studies. For example, I discussed this POT study, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome study, that was published in Nature and was then printed everywhere and discussed everywhere, and was actually a fraudulent study, in my opinion. And I did multiple discussions about that. And then we talked about with the reviewers about that study, that this study is wrong. And they just kept persisting, and that study is still out there. There is no such example in this paper of what you would say mainstream studies, which also had inaccuracies. So other retraction notices cite reasons of conclusions being reached from theoretical deductions rather than empirical evidence. So researchers, instead of actually observing something, just theorizing that I think this may be this, and then making a conjecture, then that conjecture turns out to be wrong, and then they retract that study. I actually think that this is fine, that people were conjecturing, they were trying to give ideas, and if an idea was wrong, they were good enough to come back and say, my idea was wrong, I want to retract my study. So then empirical evidence and the recount of Chinese medical staff's experience from a secondary source. Another retraction notice worryingly states that the authors, so here there is a grammatical mistake. It is, I think it is author apostrophe S, authors, instead of authors, plural. So they do not have their own manuscript properly checked for grammar. Neither do I see the same integrity that they're asking others to have in their own paper. So authors, lack of better explanation of the inclusion criteria and the triage of patients to ensure patient safety. So they're saying that there was a study that was retracted, that the authors actually did not know that what should be the inclusion criteria, how to form an inclusion criteria, and then how to triage for the patient study. So that study was retracted. Okay, that makes sense. It is worth noting that top journals are not spared, since articles concerned include those from prominent medical journals such as Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine. So I want to take a break here, and I want to show you this study. This one, apparent, and I have discussed it many times, apparent risks of postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome diagnosis after COVID-19 vaccination and SARS-CoV-2 infection. People actually really, on both sides of the aisle, the ones who said vaccines can cause injury and those who said the COVID can cause injuries, they both welcomed this paper. The groups, so everyone welcomed it. Why? Because they said vaccine and COVID. But this paper, in my opinion, is completely fraudulent. And I actually wrote to the author of this paper, and I said, your paper is wrong. I tweeted to him, and he did not respond. Then the reviewers of this paper came and started debating with me, and they were wrong. And let me just show you very quickly what was wrong. Do you see this? Do you remember this diagram that we have discussed in the past? Here in this diagram, as you see this top two blue boxes, and there is an odds ratio calculation there. Forget about the whole study. I just want to show you where the problem is. Then the orange boxes, and there is an odds ratio. Then if you come down here, POTS diagnosis, there is no odds ratio discussed here at all. This is a deliberate thing. Secondly, then because they did not count the odds ratio here, over here on the top left, you see that they looked at odds ratio. I should not have said odds ratio. Here, in the blue boxes at the bottom, they did not calculate odds, which was just a stupid thing to do, and they did it. And then over here in the top two, you see that they took a ratio of the odds, which is called odds ratio. Now, because they did not take the odds of the bottom blue boxes, they then also did not take the odds ratio. Instead, they took the incidence with the incidence comparison, which made it look like that people who have vaccine, they have less parts compared to those who have um, COVID, and they were entirely incorrect. And I called them out on this one. And this is an incorrect thing in our plain sight. It is sitting here. And imagine, look at the paper. This is in Nature. It is cited everywhere. This is an ethical and moral problem. It's not retracted. So fine, they can say that, well, because it was not retracted, we did not think about it. But it is an example of mainstream study that was wrong. So going back. So they say that Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, the retraction record, inclusive of retraction, withdrawals, corrigendums, and expression of concerns. Now, expression of concern, I want to show you one more thing. I had done a study from Sweden. I still remember it very well. It is actually the most watched video on my channel as well. And that was Pfizer vaccine becomes DNA. And that was an in vitro study where there were modified cells that behaved like a B cell. And the Pfizer vaccine, in there, the mRNA would go into the nucleus when the cell would be dividing and then become DNA. So I discussed that. Then what happened was, of course, that caused so much of a chaos in the community at that time, because this study showed that the vaccine can become DNA, and nobody, including me, nobody agreed that vaccine can become DNA. And I did show you that study because I just wanted that whatever is out there, we look at it together. So those, I reached out to these authors separately as well. I said, hey, I've worked on your study. They said, thank you very much. We've watched it. People sent it to us. Then they went under attack. I went under attack as well. Then what happened was there was an expression of concern attached to that, hey, we think that the editor said, we have a concern that people have complained about this study being wrong, and we are working to understand it. I did a follow-up video to say that this study has an expression of concern on it. However, there are still people on YouTube who have taken that study of mine and discussion of that and said Drbeen misled people. And I want to show you something. These idiots who said that have not then followed up to see, this is that study, intracellular reverse transcription of Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 mRNA vaccine in vitro in human liver cell line. If you see, the expression of concern has been removed. So they did their whatever analysis and they removed it. Nobody then went back and said, I was wrong. I was criticizing Drbeen or the study, and now there is no expression of concern. So this is fine. And sorry, I'm going to take my video down. This is the problem with the ethics in the community at this time. When the expression of concern was on it, I then did a video to say there is an expression of concern on it. Anyways, just wanted to make sure that these things are closer to home. So now this is an important data point here. What they said was that as we processed the retractions, the withdrawals, the expressions of concerns, the corrigendums, the overall percentage of such concerning studies, let's call them, was 0.074%. Right? So 0.074%. So please hold on to this number in your mind, because then they say, notably, papers on a COVID. Now, can you imagine, out of hundreds and thousands of studies, there are 0.074% retractions, and they come up with the example of hydroxychloroquine's retractions. That is the only example they want to give. Why can't they give the examples of the others as well? There are going to be many mainstream type studies that were retracted. There were hundreds of studies retracted. Anyway, so that is these authors' own bias that is showing as well. So notably, papers on a COVID-19 therapy based on an anti-malarial drug, chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, in combination or otherwise with an antibiotic, azithromycin, have received much publicity due to its anecdotal promotion by influential figures. And that was Sergey Sphere and Lancet. Now, then they said, so keep an eye on their bias. And they are actually complaining about others' biases, and they have their own biases as well. Now, how did they compare that the retraction rate is high? What they did was they looked at the retraction rate for studies for MERS, H1N1, HIV, Ebola, immunology, and cancer. So they said you can think of these as controls. So they said we took these as controls and we saw what was the rate of retraction for these and then compared them with COVID. And here is the interesting data point again. For MERS, H1N1, HIV, Ebola, and virus, the retraction rate was 0.021 to 0.024. Now, I requested you to keep in mind 0.074. That is for the COVID. So 0.02 versus 0.07. So you can see almost more than 3 times the difference. For articles included under the subject of immunology and cancer in Retraction Watch, the rate was 0.037 to 0.039. So compared to them, the COVID retraction rate was almost double. So it is not that the studies were there more, and that is why there was more retraction. This is retraction rate. This is a percentage. So the percentage was double. That means there were inaccurate studies that were being published, and then they were being retracted. And inaccuracy could mean wrong data, wrong reviews, the incorrect procedures, or incorrect hypotheses, incorrect conclusions. There can be many problems. So this table is interesting to look at. In this table, that's the same numbers that you saw. At the top, this is COVID-19 retraction rate, 0.08 and 0.09, and compared to others that acted as control. So anywhere from 0.02 to 0.4, 0.039. So double or triple was the retraction rate for COVID-19 studies. Then the authors, and so here they're saying that a standard retraction rate is 4 studies per 10,000 papers, so 0.04%. So then they talk about why these were happening. And I think that they have a really weak point of view over here. I was actually, while studying and researching this one, I was finding other papers as well for retraction discussions, and they actually had better analysis. For example, they had analyzed how many retractions because of the word mistake, how many retraction because of the data inaccuracy, how many retractions because of the peer review process wrong. These authors have done nothing. They wasted my $50 as well because I had to buy this one. Okay, so they said, why could we have a retraction? Number one, first, so for these authors, this paper that they wrote, their own processing, where could be things wrong? Number one, sampling issue. Given that the COVID-19 pandemic is still ongoing, evolving, and related papers are still being produced at a high rate, there may be a sampling rate. And I think you and I can agree that as much as they pointed out, it's kind of not really a big deal. We have such a large repository of studies for COVID-19 that we can't say that the sample size is small or inaccurate or biased. The studies they decided to give examples of, that shows their bias, because the only studies they're giving examples of are hydroxychloroquine. Okay, then the second is that there may be a significant discrepancy in coverage congruence between the papers retrieved using the same keyword. And then they respond to that as well and saying, pertaining to the second possibility, we do not think that the keyword search coverage congruence is an issue that would stand out specifically for COVID-19. They're saying if it is for COVID-19, it would be for other researches as well, so the impact is equal. So meaning, yes, these could be two issues with their processing, but not really. So then they go back to next set of opinions to say, okay, then what could be the reason for retraction? So here they're saying there could be actually misconduct by the researchers. For example, they said the genome sequence submissions that had greatly been exaggerated for the viral mutation rates, mistaken claims of similarity between SARS-CoV-2 and HIV. This is at Indian study. Can you imagine that they actually, one study which got retracted, they're actually using that as an example of all retractions. Mistaken claims of similarity between the SARS-CoV-2 and HIV, and we know that that study was retracted. Then, unusually high rate of retraction of COVID-19 related articles with an average retraction time of less than 2 weeks occurring in a matter of 4 months may well be a significant underestimate of the greater numbers in the pipeline. So they're saying there may be actually more. We do not know. Fine. That's okay as well. Then, responsibility and accountability. So now they're going to talk about the moralities and could there have been a lapse in the stringency and standards amid the rush to produce results and to publish them? Sure, could be, because there was just such a volume being published. Even preprints were, I was presenting preprints as well. Preprints were risen to the level of a studies data. Could the sense of urgency to share any findings, no matter how preliminary, that strive to curb the pandemic overwhelm the typically careful and reserved nature of scientific research? Sure. Or could authors be exploiting the thirst for article relating to COVID-19, if of any kind? And I would actually agree that, yeah, there were people who were just throwing studies out which had no merit, but their names were coming out. All of the above? Sure. Then they say it is also a possibility that enticed by funding availability, some researchers could have switched fields to work on the hot topic of the generation. So they say that it is possible that some researchers actually left other researches and did this. Fine, that's okay. On the other hand, with the high flux of submissions, the peer review system was in stress. And so that I agree with. And I'll give you an example of incorrect peer review system. Here, once again, in my opinion, this paper and its peer reviewing was all garbage. And it is still printed. There is no expression of concern. There is no retraction. This is actually still sitting out there. Furthermore, the proliferation of preprint submissions has greatly enhanced the visibility of papers which have not undergone peer review. Sure, preprints were everywhere, and they are still everywhere. Then look at this. Now they are actually presenting an analysis. They took one study for hydroxychloroquine. They took another study for that Indian study for the HIV genome. Read this one out. When I read this, at this point, I just said, this is not really the best thing to read. Check this out. While there are no data yet to indicate that a pre-exposure at preprint level enhances acceptance of a manuscript in a journal. Do you see what they're saying? That if you are a famous researcher, they say we cannot prove it that if you are a famous researcher, your preprint would be accepted. But they're saying that we cannot prove it, but that is not stopping them from making a conjecture in a manuscript. So now they're saying one of us, BLT, so the authors, one of them has a personally seen author, once again, the letter A should not have been here, has personally seen authors using the views and downloads numbers on a preprint to argue for manuscript's acceptance. Do you think that this actually belongs here? One anecdote. I personally saw somebody saying, hey, I have so many views, so my paper should be published or should be put on the preprint. What does that have with the retractions in general? I could not imagine that they would just put an anecdote in there. I saw it. Anyways, so that's what they did. The numbers we observed here Observe here would serve as reminder and caution against any lapses in the standard of work, peer review, and publication of COVID-19 related research. I wish they applied the same standards that they're arguing for others back onto their own paper. And then if you can see here, once again, they go after hydroxychloroquine, and then they have this conclusion. So this is the study. If I would balance it, I would say all kinds of studies, may those be hydroxychloroquines or ivermectins or remdesivirs or vaccines or COVID's intensity, asymptomatic, vaccines efficacy, COVID's damage, vaccines damage, all kinds of studies. There were some good data and there were some studies that were not good. And if somebody was going to present to you from a department of, what was their department? So from the department of what? Here. Research Compliance and Integrity Office. From that department, if somebody is putting a study in front of you, then hopefully that same integrity should have been adhered to here as well. I don't see that balance in this own article, but their points are fair. They make sense. Just their examples show their own bias. So this is the discussion. The reason I usually do not go into these kind of discussions, which are not medical mechanisms, but because people were sending them to me and saying, hey, did you see this? And I think that some of the implications, inferences in there was, you have talked about the study. So fortunately, the study that I talked about, for which people have made videos about me being misleading, those expression of concerns are actually gone. So this is the study. Please like, subscribe, and share this video if you like this video. And then if you would like to support this work, there are links in the description. You can buy access to Drbeen at a very, very reasonable price. You can use PayPal to support this work. You can buy me a coffee to support this work. You can become part of patrons or Substack. So there are so many options if you like this work. So I could not actually imagine for this paper that they were kind of mulling over in their head and thinking aloud and putting that in the paper that, well, others may have these problems. And they themselves were showing that. Can you put an anecdote in a paper? One of us saw this. Who cares? One of you saw. There are many people who like. I am asking, can you please like and subscribe and share? Does that mean that whatever I've discussed is wrong now? So this is the discussion. I would like to hear from you as well. What do you think? Am I correct in criticizing this study, or this study is on point and I may be mistaken, or is the story somewhere in the middle? Let me know. And I would see you on Monday. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.